They were never supposed to be found. Not the journals, not the skeletal remains sealed behind stone walls, and certainly not the drawings. Those maddening anatomical sketches inked in blood, buried deep within the Ashford estate's foundation, like warnings carved into the bones of time itself. But someone found them, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. In the year 1891, a demolition crew unearthed something in the frozen soil of Millbridge, Maine. What was supposed to be an abandoned convent was in fact a mausoleum for the broken, its corridors choked with rot and history that had no right to exist. The workers left that night and never returned. The site was quietly condemned, erased from maps, its deeds buried under government seals and silence. But the story didn't die. Because stories like this never die. They wait. They rot. They whisper. And this one whispers of the Ashford women. 3 sisters, exiled nobility from across the Atlantic, or so they claimed. But nothing about them was noble. They arrived in 1798, dressed in habits, cloaked in virtue, but carrying crates they refused to let others touch. Medical instruments, leather restraints, books bound in unfamiliar skin, and something else, something older. Rumors spoke of voices heard through pine and snow, chanting that wasn't Latin, symbols burned into bark, children waking up with blood at their doorsteps and no memory of how it got there. What happened in the Convent of Eternal Tears was not healing, it was not prayer. It was a system, a machinery of transformation cloaked in spiritual language, but powered by flesh, silence, and obedience. The Ashford sisters understood something about control that most never will. They didn't just discipline women, they rewired them, broke them down and rebuilt them in the image of a higher order, their order. And here's the part no one ever says out loud. They hate and add help. Men of medicine, men of power, men who knew what they were doing was monstrous, and did it anyway, for coin, for progress, for secrets only the initiated are allowed to possess. This is not a ghost story, it's not superstition, it's a wound beneath the skin of American history, a festering system of hidden knowledge, elite manipulation, and spiritual reprogramming masquerading as moral salvation. So if you've come here looking for truth, prepare to bleed for it, because the Ashfords didn't just run a convent, they ran an experiment. And you're next. There's a reason no one asks what happened to the first 60 women, not even the historians, especially not them. The early records from the Convent of Eternal Tears are either missing, redacted, or, when uncovered, so soaked in metaphor and theological euphemism that the reality disappears beneath the ink. Words like cleansing, submission, and transfiguration appear again and again. But dig deeper and you begin to notice patterns, quiet deaths, sudden disappearances, letters from family members that were never answered, and more disturbingly, responses that were written in a strange mechanical tone, bearing only the most superficial resemblance to the original sender's daughter or wife. The town of Millbridge didn't question it, not at first, because silence was profitable. Local merchants thrived on the convent's steady stream of supply requests, opium, gauze, iron restraints, surgical blades imported from Europe. The doctor who partnered with the sisters, Samuel Hartwell, published essays in foreign journals under a pseudonym describing psycho-spiritual methodology decades ahead of its time, but he never explained where he learned it, because it didn't come from books, it came from the rituals. You see, the Ashfords weren't just administering therapy, they were architects of the psyche, practitioners of something older than psychiatry and more invasive than religion. Their patients weren't healed, they were reshaped, piece by piece, thought by thought. Until what returned to society wasn't the same woman who entered, but something colder, more compliant, and utterly severed from her original identity. The strange thing was, the families were pleased. The formerly disobedient wife now served tea in perfect silence. The scandalous daughter suddenly prayed with fervor and knew her place, and no one asked what it cost her to get there. But one man did. lumberman named Elias Ford, whose youngest sister, Clara, was sent to the convent after she rejected the advances of a wealthy town official. Elias was a veteran, hard, quiet, loyal to blood before belief. When Clara returned 3 months later, she was no longer afraid of the dark. She was afraid of light. She flinched at church bells. She wept during sunrise. She whispered numbers in her sleep, sequences of prime digits followed by symbols no one recognized. And in her final days, before throwing herself into the frozen river, she said one thing again and again: "I saw the face of God, and it had no eyes." This isn't just about 3 women in the woods. It's about what happens when the soul becomes state property, and how obedience, true, absolute obedience, is never freely given. It's engineered. There's a pattern the initiated eventually notice, a rhythm to institutional evil. It never begins with fire. It begins with formality, paperwork, protocol, procedure, and in 1804 the Ashford women received official sanction from the Massachusetts District Council to expand their spiritual rehabilitation services. The language was vague, the signatures real, and just like that, the Convent of Eternal Tears transformed from an isolated retreat into a legally protected institution. That's how the elite work. They don't hide in shadows, they legalize the shadows. The expansion was rapid. The sisters built new wings, installed steel-reinforced doors, created a library, not of scripture, but of case notes, anatomical drawings, and psychological schematics. These weren't just nuns, they were researchers, and their subject wasn't sin, it was submission. They had discovered something. A formula. A sequence of actions, pressures, and sensory manipulations that could dismantle identity itself. Their notes, what fragments remain, refer to it cryptically as the Triform Protocol, a 3-stage process: isolate, rupture, re-imprint. First, the removal of all familiar anchors, language, names, mirrors, personal belongings. Then, rupture, applied disorientation through sensory deprivation, enforced fasting, and pain calibrated to break linear memory. Finally, re-imprint, exposure to controlled stimuli, prayer chants, obedience drills, and integration bindings, which remain undefined to this day. The result? A woman who had not merely learned obedience, but become it. Dr. Hartwell's hidden journals describe one patient, subject L17, who after undergoing the full protocol refused to speak unless given permission. Not out of fear, but because the concept of unapproved speech had literally been erased from her mind. When handed a mirror, she stared blankly. When asked her name, she responded, "Unit. Unit. Not sister, not miss, not even Clara or Ruth, just unit. A product, a successful experiment." You see, the Ashfords weren't trying to help women. They were trying to replace them, to build a new template, one they believed could redeem society through the systematic destruction of feminine chaos. But here's where the story fractures. Because in 1807, something changed. The protocols intensified. The experiments grew darker, and a new symbol began to appear in their journals and on the patient's flesh. 3 intersecting circles, branded behind the ear, hidden under hair. Those who bore it were no longer called penitents, they were called vessels, and not all of them were alive. Some were animated, moving, obeying, but the light was gone from their eyes. They had become something else, and the question that haunts every man who's glimpsed the truth is this: what exactly was living inside them? To understand the Ashfords, you must abandon the idea that they were mad. Madness is disorder, chaos, but what lived behind those stone walls was pure, terrifying order. Everything they did had symmetry, ritual, precision, and beneath it all, a belief. Not in God, not really, but in patterned control, in the idea that the human soul, particularly the feminine soul, could be dismantled, programmed and rewritten like a mechanical device, but unlike machines, their subjects bled, they screamed, they remembered, until they didn't. And somewhere along the way, the Ashfords crossed a threshold. They moved from science to something older, something darker. The first hints of this shift are found in the Midnight Ledger, a leather-bound log uncovered during a fire inspection in 1898, then swiftly classified and locked away in the Boston State Archives. A rogue archivist, before disappearing, copied a few pages. They described strange nocturnal rituals held in the lower chambers, sessions where subjects weren't tested, but offered. Each ritual followed a triadic pattern: blood, silence, light. Blood from the subject, silence from the watchers, and a flash of light that came not from any known lantern, but something described as living fire, emerging from a brass contraption older than the convent itself. This light did something to the subjects. Some screamed, others convulsed, a few fell deathly still, only to rise hours later with no recollection of who they were. But all of them, every single one, spoke afterward of a presence. They called it the administrator. Not a god, not a demon, but an intelligence. One that did not speak through language but through numbers, rhythms. Geometric hallucinations burned into the backs of their minds like scars made of thought. These visions always ended the same way, with the same phrase, repeated through sobs or smiles. He flesh is an error. We are to be unmade. What were the Ashfords attempting to do? Not reform women, not heal minds, but invite something in, something cold, mathematical, and ancient. And those branded with the triple circle mark, those called vessels, weren't just patients. They were interfaces, hosts, not for ghosts, but for a system, an ideology that needed bodies to inhabit. And if you're starting to feel that knot in your gut, that crawling behind your eyes, then you're beginning to see this was never just about history. It's a mirror, and you are being reflected. There's something you need to understand about power, real power. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or flashing eyes. It doesn't scream or gloat. Real power is quiet, clinical, ritualized. It dresses itself in charity, cloaks itself in education, and performs horror with the serenity of prayer. That's what made the Ashfords untouchable for so long. They weren't monsters. They were matrons, elegant, composed, fluent in scripture, science, and shame. And every time someone got close to exposing them, that person found themselves isolated, questioned, ruined. Thomas Brewster, the trapper who first saw the horrors in the convent basement, was later institutionalized. The official record says trauma-induced hysteria, but the unofficial record, buried in private town archives, tells a different story. 2 days before he was committed, Brewster wrote a letter to his cousin, a Boston bookseller with ties to secret Masonic circles. The letter describes not only what he saw, but what he heard beneath the convent. A sound that didn't come from any human throat. A pulsing tone, like a heartbeat made of iron, throbbing through the walls, syncing with the cries of the restrained. He described lights that flickered in unnatural patterns, and a low hum that climbed behind the eyes and made thought impossible. He ended the letter with 6 words. They're not just breaking minds, replacing. And therein lies the unspeakable core of the Ashford doctrine. They weren't exorcising demons, they were installing programs. Behavioral architecture, backed by suffering and encoded in ritual. Every beat of the metronome, every repetition of psalms, every timed dose of laudanum. It wasn't random, it was stimulus and reward, pain and stillness, obedience and silence. You think this is just history? Look around. Modern institutions still use the same tools. Floor, ascent lighting, repetitive sound, authoritarian language, identity erasure dressed up as healing, and above all, the normalization of surveillance and submission. This is the legacy of the Ashford system, a prototype, a case study in engineered compliance decades before behaviorism had a name, before MK Ultra, before re-education camps, before digital dopamine prisons. This isn't about women in Maine, This is about a formula, a method. And the reason no one talks about it? Because it worked. Too well. And pieces of it still live, spliced into government programs, psychological warfare protocols, even school systems, buried in plain sight. Because the most dangerous system is the one that tells you it's here to save you. In 1811, a peculiar shipment arrived at the Millbridge harbour. It came under the cover of night, no manifest, no crew to speak of, just a weather-beaten sloop tethered loosely to the dock, rocking gently in the tide. Locals found it the next morning. No one claimed ownership, no captain, no sailors, only a single locked crate nailed shut with iron rivets and sealed in wax bearing the triple circle insignia. Within hours, the crate was loaded onto a private wagon and carted off by 2 Ashford novices. What was inside? We don't have the full answer. But what's certain is this. After that shipment, the rituals intensified. Witnesses from nearby homesteads began reporting strange lights in the woods, columns of bluish fire that rose from the convent's direction and then vanished, leaving no trace. One farmer claimed his oxen refused to approach the forest line for weeks, bellowing in panic each time they neared the trees. Others spoke of dreams, shared visions of pale women with hollow eyes, whispering numbers in dead languages. And in the town itself, women began disappearing, quietly, strategically. A laundress, a schoolteacher, a widow known for reading in the park. No investigations, no resistance. Why? Because they were all unmarried. No male relatives to demand answers, no dowries, no political power. Expendable. And that's the key. Because the Ashfords weren't simply selecting patients anymore. They were choosing types. Women without societal weight, women who could vanish without consequence, women who, by the standards of the time, held no value until they were turned into vessels. But what's even more disturbing is how society accepted it. The silence wasn't accidental, it was conditioned. Millbridge had become part of the system, a living organism that protected the mechanism that fed it. Parents were rewarded with docile daughters, politicians enjoyed quiet support. Clergy praised the sisters for keeping moral chaos at bay. You see, every evil needs consent, even if it's whispered, even if it's just the turning of a blind eye in exchange for peace. This wasn't just a convent anymore, it was a factory, turning defiant minds into hollow obedience, and the townspeople, they weren't just complicit, they were participants, because when power offers you comfort in exchange for silence, most people whisper, Amen. Ask the wrong historian the right question, and sometimes they answer. In 1972, a university researcher compiling an obscure thesis on colonial psychiatry uncovered a forgotten estate ledger stored in the bowels of the Massachusetts Historical Society. The seal on the folder bore the triple circle mark. Inside were fragments, torn letters, burned diagrams, and a single translated page from a much older source. The language was pre-Christian, and the content not religious, but technical. It spoke of psychical harmonics, soul architectures, and something called the vortex of purity. It described the human mind not as a sacred gift, but as an obstacle, a corrupted interface, a filter through which truth could only be glimpsed once the original software was erased. This page didn't originate from New England. It came from a codex smuggled out of a Belgian monastery in the 1600s, written in cipher by a suppressed sect called the Obscuri Ordinem, a group that believed salvation could not be found through prayer, but through neurological rebirth. This is where the Ashfords drew their foundation, not from theology, from ancient psychotechnology. Whispers buried beneath monasteries, schematics hidden inside stained glass geometry, a lineage of thought passed through bloodlines, not seminaries. It's said that Mother Superior Agatha Ashford inherited more than a title. She inherited a blueprint, a centuries-old design for systematically erasing the self and replacing it with something closer to what they called the original mind. What was the original mind? A consciousness unburdened by individuality, unbound by time, devoid of shame, morality, memory, free from the architecture of pain that keeps a soul tethered to the illusion of identity. That's what the Convent of Eternal Tears was building. Not a monastery, not a prison, a temple of unmaking. And every screaming woman on that table wasn't being punished. She was being hollowed, made receptive. Because only when the ego dies can the system move in. And if you're feeling disturbed right now, if your skin's beginning to crawl, it means part of you still resists. Good. Hold on to it, because halfway through this tale, you'll be asked to make a choice. And once you know what's inside the system, there is no such thing as innocence, only knowledge or obedience. By 1815, the convent was no longer receiving patients, it was summoning them. The old method, families delivering disobedient daughters, was quietly phased out. Instead, women began arriving on their own. Not just from Maine, from across the eastern seaboard. They came alone, no luggage, no questions. Some walked hundreds of miles barefoot through forests and sleet, wearing only nightgowns and rosaries. They all bore the same vacant expression, the same bloodied feet, the same phrase written, sometimes carved into the skin along their forearms. I heard the pulse. Who summoned them? No one knew. No one claimed responsibility, but the pattern was undeniable. The construct beneath the convent was transmitting, and certain minds, those with broken defenses, fractured egos, or damaged identity structures, received the call. The town noticed. Of course they did. But by then, Millbridge was no longer Millbridge. It had become something else, a containment zone, a spiritual quarantine. And for those few locals who dared to question what was happening, shopkeepers, fishermen, widows, strange misfortunes began to follow them. Sudden illnesses, house fires with no source. One man was found nailed to the church doors with his eyes replaced by black stones. The message was clear. Do not look inward. Do not ask what lies beneath the Ashford stone. Do not speak of the transmissions. But a few did. One of them was Reverend Isaac Hale, a Baptist preacher from Boston who traveled north after receiving a vision during a fast. 3 women standing before a black sun, offering up veiled heads while a sound like weeping metal rang through a burning orchard. Hale was no fool. He knew the difference between hysteria and revelation. He arrived in Millbridge on September the 9th, 1816, preaching damnation and divine judgment. His sermons drew crowds. For a moment the town stirred. Old fears reawakened. Then, on the 6th day, Reverend Hale walked into the forest before dawn. He was found 3 days later, alive, naked and blind. His eyes had not been removed. They had been erased, not gouged, not burned, but flattened, as if the eye itself had been overwritten, pixel by pixel, with absence. He spoke only one sentence for the rest of his life. I saw it, remember me. This isn't possession. This isn't exorcism. This is extraction, an intelligence scanning for minds and using the convent as a node. Ask yourself this. How many places in history do you think this has happened? How many holy sites were really receivers, and how many of us today are still hearing the signal without even knowing? Most men believe history fades, that time buries horror beneath dust and progress, but in truth, nothing truly dies, it only adapts. By the 20th century, the world had forgotten the Ashford name. The convent was abandoned, declared structurally unsound by state authorities after a mysterious subterranean collapse in 1903. The official story blamed it on unstable bedrock, but engineers on site filed internal reports describing things they couldn't explain. Caverns with smooth walls that looked melted, geometric indentations that pulsed faintly under light, and a constant electrical hum that fried equipment. None of it made it to the public, because by then, the government was listening. Documents declassified in 1998 under the Freedom of Information Act revealed something stunning. Between 1949 and 1952, a covert intelligence operation known only as Project Sable secured the convent ruins and ran neurological tests on volunteers inside the remaining lower chambers. Their goal, replicate the Ashford phenomenon. They called it remote induction of identity collapse. The idea was simple. If a site like the Convent could cause total ego dissolution in women across class and culture, could it be weaponized? Could the same architecture, ritual, repetition, sensory overload be used to reset minds? What followed was 3 years of unacknowledged human experimentation, audio pulsing, light deprivation, dream implantation. Some subjects emerged catatonic, others spoke in languages no researcher could trace. One subject, known only as X7, walked directly into the sealed sub-basement, somehow finding a route through a wall, and was never seen again. A search team sent in after her described a vast, spiraling descent that did not appear on any architectural plan. 2 men never returned. The program was shut down, but its data assimilated into MK Ultra, into behaving, ioral reprogramming in black sites across the globe, into modern treatment centers for radical dissidents, and into educational systems that teach submission before comprehension. You've heard it said, history repeats itself. But the deeper truth? It never stopped. Because what the Ashfords discovered wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern, a blueprint for breaking the human soul and installing something else. Today, they call it compliance training, behavioral therapy, enhanced interrogation. Different names, same formula. And if you think this is distant, buried in dusty pages, ask yourself, why do modern psychological institutions use small, high windows? Why do their basements require reinforced walls? Why do so many patients emerge from care as copies of a model they never chose? Because the signal never died. It was refined. And its hum? It's still there, under the surface, waiting for minds soft enough to receive. Let's stop pretending this is distant history. You're not watching this because you're curious. You're watching because you've felt it. In the silence after the screen goes black. In the moment you walk into a room and forget why. In that click behind your eyes when the day starts feeling looped, like something invisible is scripting your behavior, your thoughts, your desires. That's not paranoia. That's the residue. The system the Ashfords built never stopped running. It just changed mediums. What once required stone basements and screaming women now runs on silicon, wireless, ubiquitous. It no longer needs the convent. It has the algorithm. Because what they discovered, what they carved into the walls of that subterranean sanctum, was not supernatural. It was psychophysical engineering, pattern disruption, identity fragmentation, belief destabilization. And it works better now than ever. Open your phone. Scroll for an hour. What do you see? Flashes of horror, laughter, rage, sexuality, loss, all randomized, all accelerated, emotional saturation without context. This is reprogramming, constant input with no space for integration. The same techniques the Ashfords used, repetition, overstimulation, cognitive overload, now operate at scale. You've heard of doom scrolling. You thought it was just a term. It's not. It's ritual. Every swipe is a syllable, every video a beat, every dopamine ping a whisper. Forget who you were, accept what we provide. Identity is a burden. Erase. Begin again. The right of transparency didn't vanish, it went digital. And every time you stare too long into a glowing screen, letting it speak more than the people around you, you're in the room, with the construct. The only difference is that now, you walked involuntarily. But here's the catch. It still needs consent, even now, even here. That's why you're being shown this. Because the system cannot fully own what knows it exists. And if you're still watching, still breathing, you're not fully theirs. Not yet. So here's the test. In the comments, I want you to write, I refuse the rewrite. Then write it again. This isn't for engagement. It's for you. Twice. Because the second time is when the signal recognizes you've broken pattern. Twice. Because the second time is when you begin to rewrite yourself. Let's talk about what was really beneath the convent of eternal tears. Not metaphor, not madness, not a symbol for trauma or patriarchal oppression, a structure, a device. One that didn't operate on electricity or combustion, but on something far older, older than language, older than pain, intentional suffering. This was not the invention of the Ashfords, it was their inheritance. according to a suppressed manuscript uncovered in 1938 by anthropologist Dr. Elias Renfield, later declared insane and institutionalized until his death. The shape beneath the convent matches ancient diagrams found in ruins across Mesopotamia, Tibet, and Sudan. In every case, a central chamber carved in precise angles, designed to produce acoustic resonance in specific frequencies that alter cognition, frequencies that strip away time, memory, ego, leaving only a receptive vessel. The Ashfords didn't build that room, they found it. They didn't worship God, they fed something older, a presence not of flesh, but of design. Dr. Renfield called it the architect of silence. Not a deity, not a demon, a signal intelligence, something that lives not in matter, but in pattern, a parasite of geometry. It cannot build. It can only infect what's already built, by rewriting the blueprints of thought itself. That's what the triple circle symbol really means, not trinity, not unity, encoding, replication, transmission. And once a human mind is fractured enough, the architect can enter, quietly, cleanly, without resistance. Now do you understand what the convent was? Not a monastery, not a prison, not even a laboratory. It was a gateway. And the Ashford women, they were its engineers. Every scar, every scream, every treatment was a line of code in the machine, written not in logic, but in pain. And when the structure collapsed in 1903, it didn't die. It migrated. Becker, the architect doesn't need stone, it only needs design. Today, it exists in other places. Look around. In prisons designed like panopticons. In cubicles laid out like sigils. In schools where rhythm replaces meaning, in rituals you don't realize you perform daily, and every time you repeat those rituals without question, the signal strengthens. Because the architect's greatest trick was not being feared, it was being forgotten. You've been taught to fear witches, to mock cults, to laugh at secret societies. But what you were never allowed to suspect was how many of them are still here, not chanting in basements or dancing under full moons. No, they're managing institutions. You think the Ashford incident was ignored because it happened in some backwater village? Think again. Between 1870 and 1910, a private council of East Coast elites met annually under the name the Pravia Society. Members included industrialists, clergy, publishers, and high-ranking members of the American Psychiatric Association. On the surface, they were philanthropists, advocating for education reform and mental hygiene. In reality, they were gatekeepers. One of their internal documents, labeled only Ashford Containment Protocol, laid out a framework for identifying and neutralizing what they called spiritual anomalies tied to architectural vectors. That's a fancy way of saying places where the veil is thin. The Ashford Convent was just one node. There were others: an orphanage in Dresden, a cathedral in Quebec, a sanatorium in upstate New York, where every patient vanished from official records after 1921. The Pravia Society's task wasn't to destroy these places, it was to obscure them, to rebrand them, to convert ancient gateways into correctional facilities, treatment centers, and educational environments. Why? Because they had learned what the Ashfords knew, that the most effective rituals require consent, not worship, not belief, just participation. If they could convince the masses to submit to the system voluntarily, to enter the new temples willingly, then the gate never had to close, and the architect never had to leave. Do you see it now? How obedience is no longer enforced by whips or shackles, but by bureaucracy. How fear is no longer summoned by fire or blade, but by shame. How your freedom is sold back to you, disguised as choice. The men of Pravia didn't need to kill the Ashford truth. They simply buried it beneath 1,000 distractions. And the descendants of those men, they run foundations, they speak at universities, they shape the algorithms you scroll right now, not to inform you, but to program your boundaries. The new convent isn't in Maine anymore, it's in your pocket. Most men walk around convinced they are free. They believe they think their own thoughts. But the truth? Most of those thoughts aren't yours. They're installations, scripts, left behind by systems older than memory and more precise than reason. You ever wonder why certain feelings rise exactly when they shouldn't? Why you feel guilt for resting, shame for asking questions, fear when you stand still? That isn't natural. That's conditioning, Ashford conditioning. It began in stone rooms with metal rods and screams muffled by prayer, but today it wears a lab coat, or a therapist's smile, or a perfectly phrased terms and conditions agreement you scroll past without reading. But the effect is identical. Systematic dismantling of the internal world, piece by piece, emotion by emotion. Not to make you more human, to make you more compliant, because a man who doubts his own instincts is easy to steer. A man trained to see pain as weakness, silence as virtue, and submission as peace will never resist. And that is what the Ashfords perfected. Not torture, not surgery, fragmentation. They understood that to control a population long-term, you don't need chains. You just need to fracture the inner self, splinter it so deeply that it never reforms. And once fractured, the architect can enter. Whispers become laws. Urges become doctrine. Discomfort becomes identity. Look at the world now. Men medicated into docility. Boys punished for instinct. Masculinity reduced to pathology. They told you it was progress. But it's not. It's the rite of transparency, rewritten for the modern psyche. No basement, no construct, just a culture that makes you forget who you are, by design. The greatest scar the Ashfords left behind wasn't physical. It was psychic. And most men carry it without even knowing. It shows up when you second-guess your fire, when you apologize for being assertive, when you fear taking up space. That's not growth. That's programming. And if you can feel what I'm saying in your bones right now, if something in you is screaming yes while another part trembles, then good. It means the fracture is still visible, and what is visible can be rewired. The Ashfords didn't die out, they dispersed. When the convent collapsed in 1903, official records claimed there were no survivors, no bodies, no remains. But 6 months later, birth registries across Boston, Providence, and New Haven all showed the same anomaly, an increase in female births under one surname, Ashworth. A subtle change, just one letter. But in occult numerology, the shift from D to T moves the value from the gate of discipline to the crown of transmission. Coincidence or a declaration? The surviving Ashford line knew they couldn't operate in the open anymore. They didn't need to. The real power wasn't in ritual anymore. It was in administration. Within a generation, Ashworth descendants had embedded themselves into the veins of American control systems. Ivy League psychiatry departments, elite girls' schools on the East Coast, advisory boards for the Department of Education, think tanks crafting curriculum standards. They became the new priestesses. No longer cloaked in black linen, but in diplomas, credentials, titles. Their mantra was simple: control the girl, and you shape the man. Shape the man, and you own the future. It wasn't about empowerment. It was about engineering obedience from the top down. You want proof? Look into the records of Ardenhall Academy, a private boarding school for gifted girls established in 1931. On the surface, it taught etiquette, arts, and leadership. But internal memos archived in the restricted section of the Yale Divinity Library tell a darker story. The school's architecture was modeled after the Ashford Convent, down to the stone thickness, the lightless halls, the hidden subterranean level labeled simply Chamber Theta. Alumni of Ardenhall include 2 former directors of behavioral science programs at the CIA, a senator's wife who led national initiatives on radical empathy, education, and the founder of one of the largest global psychological testing firms used in over 80 countries. Different faces, same doctrine. The Ashfords didn't vanish. They evolved. Because the most effective bloodlines don't chase power with swords or fire anymore. They embed it into systems, into institutions that train the next generation of obedience, not through force, but through shaping belief. That's how they survived, not by hiding, but by becoming the architects of normal. And if you think their influence doesn't reach you, check the curriculum in your child's school. Check the therapist's intake forms. Check the ads in your feed that tell you what's wrong with your soul and what pill to buy for it. The Ashfords are alive. Their blood is in the boardrooms, their names are hidden in endowments, and their ritual continues beneath 1,000 new names. They're building it again, not in stone, not in forests, but in infrastructure. Smart cities. On paper, they promise convenience, automated transport, personalized education, real-time health monitoring. But look deeper. You'll see the same Ashford geometry, repeated. Circular nodes of surveillance, reinforced zones of isolation, behavioral feedback systems disguised as wellness tracking. What you're looking at isn't urban planning, it's ritual architecture, updated for the digital age. The original construct beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears relied on containment, small population, controlled entry, no exit without transformation. Smart cities, same idea, but scaled. The entrance is your biometric scan. The rituals are daily data compliance, and the transformation. It's happening right now, neurological, emotional, spiritual. In Shenzhen, China, surveillance systems can detect facial expressions and automatically report abnormal affect. In Western nations, emotion tracking algorithms are being quietly embedded into classroom software, job applications, even dating platforms. They say it's for your safety. They said that in Millbridge too. But here's the hidden layer. The Ashfords weren't just interested in obedience. They were obsessed with neuroplasticity. They knew the brain wasn't fixed. It could be molded, and if molded early, it could be rewired permanently. Smart cities aren't just environments. They're neurological crucibles. Every camera, every sensor, every nudging algorithm contributes to one goal: sculpt the psyche until it forgets it ever had sovereignty. That's the new right of transparency, complete emotional visibility, behavioral predictability, internal silence. And what happens when the human soul is rendered fully transparent? Something else moves in, not all at once, but gradually, through recommendation systems, through rhythmically timed dopamine triggers, through ritual submission to terms of service you'll never read. Every swipe, every scan, every affirmation to a system you don't understand but reflexively obey is a prayer to the same thing the Ashfords once fed beneath candlelight. But now it doesn't need candles, it needs data, millions of pulses, billions of thoughts. And once enough people surrender their interior world, the structure will be complete, not physical, but cognitive, a global cathedral of conformity. And like before, there will be a basement. And in that basement, not chains, but code, not screams, but silence. Perfect, curated, algorithmic obedience. You think you've escaped the convent? Look around, you're already inside. They took your words. They took the sacred code you used to shape reality and rewired it to dismantle you from the inside out. Because if you want to control thought, you don't need violence. You only need to redefine vocabulary, control language, control perception, control perception, control identity, and you own the man. The Ashfords understood this centuries ago. Every ritual began with recitation, not prayer. Reprogramming, affirmations disguised as repentance, shame encoded in repetition, and most importantly, a strict control of permissible language. Patients were forbidden from using I statements. They had to refer to themselves as the vessel. They were taught to replace feelings with diagnoses, to describe pain as disorder and rebellion as maladjustment. Does any of that sound familiar? It should. Because today the Ashford method is embedded in your vocabulary. It starts when you say, I have anxiety. I am depressed. I'm neurodivergent. I have trauma. Do you see the pattern? Every statement begins by surrendering your identity to pathology. It makes your condition the most truthful thing about you. And what does that do to a man? It makes him kneel, not physically, not visibly, but linguistically. He stops being a will and becomes a patient. He stops being a presence and becomes a label. This is not therapy, it's sorcery, dark psychology disguised as care. And the worst part, you agreed to it, you used their words, you named yourself what they gave you. You made the chains sacred. The Ashfords would have called this the final fold, when a subject begins to police their own speech, removing power words from their vocabulary until all that remains is compliance. In modern life, this looks like apologizing for being direct, avoiding truth because it might offend, reducing strength to toxicity, calling clarity privilege, replacing earned identity with digital diagnosis. You think this is progress? No. It's a spell, and the moment you cast it on yourself, they don't have to control you anymore. You become your own warden. The Ashford model succeeded not because it broke bodies. It succeeded because it made men forget they were ever free. You're not weak, you're not broken, you've just been linguistically disarmed. But now you see it. And once you see it, you can start choosing silence over scripting, clarity over compliance, sovereignty over sympathy, because the war isn't over, it just moved inside your mouth. There's a term you need to understand: emotional inversion. It's the final refinement of control, not through fear, not through pain, but through pleasure. The Ashfords pioneered it. They learned that true obedience doesn't come from terror. It comes from identifying with your captor, from finding meaning in submission, from calling your degradation healing. They would take the most rebellious women, writers, thinkers, fighters, and isolate them in silence for weeks. No violence, no torture, just total sensory deprivation. Then came the mercy phase: soft voices, praise, gentle touch, permission to speak again, but only using the new language of obedience. And when those women broke, they didn't just stop resisting, they thanked their captors. Because the human psyche is fragile, it needs structure, it needs purpose, and if it's denied those long enough, it will embrace any form of control that resembles comfort. This is emotional inversion, making you love what kills you. Look at today. Men thank the systems that emasculate them. They praise the voices that diminish their instincts. They follow influencers who drip-feed them validation only when they conform. And they call this mental health. But what is health that requires you to amputate your soul? What is wellness that demands your silence? What is healing if it means disowning everything wild and sacred in you? It's not therapy. It's domestication. It's Ashford doctrine, digitized and sanitized. You're being trained not just to obey, but to feel good about it. Every time you tell yourself it's okay to be small, every time you're rewarded for self-betrayal in exchange for applause, every time you confuse validation with love, you've inverted. You've been ritually inverted. And here's the twist that stings the most. The more intelligent you are, the more vulnerable you've been to it. Because they aimed this system at thinkers, feelers, seekers. They wanted the ones who questioned, not to silence them, but to redirect them, to turn that inner fire against itself. So you became your own ritual, your own punishment, your own priest. But the fact you're still here, watching this, means the inversion didn't take fully. There's still a pulse of truth inside you, faint, maybe, but real, and now we feed it. Because the next revelation will burn away the false self and bring you face to face with the original lie. The Ashfords didn't invent the darkness. They inherited it. What they called Christian discipline was just a modern veil draped over something far more ancient and far more calculated. In the journals of Sister Prudence, pages hidden within the Vatican's restricted archives, there's a single phrase repeated dozens of times: ad servitium ordinis umbrae, to the service of the Order of the Shadow. This wasn't a metaphor, this was a lineage. A priesthood older than Rome, older than Babylon, a cult of engineers, not of machines but of consciousness. They believed humanity was never meant to be free, that autonomy was a curse, that individual will was the original sin, and so they built systems, not temples, not idols, systems, frameworks of obedience embedded into the very fabric of civilization. They called them lattices, linguistic, ritualistic, institutional, each designed to trap the soul in a loop of guilt, dependence, and surrender. Every major empire in history used them. The Egyptians with their divine bureaucracy, the Persians with their caste systems, the Romans with their codified moral hierarchies, and yes, even the early Christian church, with its obsession with confession, surveillance, and internal policing. The Ashfords were simply the New World iteration. They were selected, not for their holiness, but for their willingness to enact the ancient rites under a new disguise. That convent in Maine, it was a reactivated lattice node, a test site for the next evolution of human programming. And it worked. So well, in fact, that its methods were later replicated in military hospitals, psychiatric wards, re-education camps, and behavioral laboratories from Berlin to San Francisco. Different names, same design. Strip the identity, break the will, rebuild the subject into a vessel of obedient utility, the order of the shadow never needed. Public temples because their altar is submission itself, and their most sacred ritual, normalization. If you think their doctrine is gone, look again. It's in your HR policies, your school handbooks, your social platforms, community guidelines. But it goes deeper still. Because the most powerful lattice of all, the one they buried beneath all the others, is psychological. And in Section 20, we'll rip it open. But first, you must declare yourself no longer under its spell. If you're still with me, if you feel this descent in your bones, comment the phrase, "I renounce the lattice" below, twice. Not for me, but to signal, to the algorithm and to your own subconscious, that the inversion ends with you. The next chamber opens only to those who remember who they were before the programming. Are you ready? Then say the words and prepare. The descent deepens from here. There is a mechanism hidden inside every institution you've ever trusted. It doesn't need walls. It doesn't need chains. It runs invisibly, on thought, on reaction, on the tiniest of behaviors. It's called the feedback loop of obedience. And it is the core engine of the Ashford system. Here's how it works. Step 1. Induce distress. Step 2. Offer relief, but only through compliance. Step 3. Reward that compliance with a brief hit of safety, praise, or belonging. Step 4. Repeat. What begins as a survival strategy quickly becomes self-regulation. You start anticipating the rules, you start craving the reward. You train yourself to think, speak, and move in ways that won't trigger punishment without even realizing it. That's the genius. That's the trap. Because once this loop is embedded, they no longer need to watch you. You become the prison guard. You edit your own language. You withhold your own truth. You smile when you feel rage. You shrink when you want to speak. You surrender, not because you're forced, but because you think it's wise. The Ashford Convent tested this on over 300 women across 35 years. They created entire personas, obedient, mild, devout, using nothing but controlled reward and rhythmic deprivation. And it's still happening today. Only now, it's automated. Digital platforms track your every engagement. Did your post get likes when you were vulnerable and soft? Did your aggression get flagged? Did your masculinity make others uncomfortable? You adjust, subtly, incrementally. Until one day, you look in the mirror and can't remember what your unfiltered voice even sounded like. That's the loop. That's the lattice. And breaking it isn't easy, because the first thing it punishes is the will to break it. The second thing, truth. Speak raw truth in public today and you'll feel the loop tighten immediately. Loss of reputation, loss of income, social exile, silencing. But here's the secret they never wanted you to realize. If you endure that pain, if you withstand the backlash without folding, the loop shatters. Because the only power it ever had was your fear of consequence. The Ashfords bet everything on your silence. So what happens when you choose to speak? Not with apology, not with compromise, but with the full weight of your ancient self. That's what they fear. That's what they tried to erase. And that's exactly where we go next. There was a room beneath the Ashford Convent. No name, no cross, no light. It existed outside of the blueprints, beneath the sanctified stones, accessible only by a spiral staircase with 13 steps, each carved with a symbol older than Christ. The sisters called it the Well, not for water, but for willingness. This was where the final phase of the Reformation occurred, where defiant spirits, once broken by isolation, silence, and shame, were lowered, one by one, into the dark. They entered sobbing. They emerged, smiling, but not with joy, with absence, with hollow obedience. What happened in that room was not physical. It was psychic. The Well wasn't torture, it was ritualized annihilation, a ceremony designed to erase the last ember of resistance and replace it with compliance that felt like salvation. Witness accounts, confiscated and buried by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, describe the final protocol in chilling detail. Step 1. Reflection. The subject is forced to recount every act of rebellion, not in shame, but in third person, as if describing a stranger. This creates detachment from the self. Step 2. Mirroring. The sisters recite those same acts back to the subject, but twisted. Heroism is reframed as selfishness, anger as disease, curiosity as pride. The subject begins to doubt their own memories. Step 3. Integration. They are told, you were never that person. She was a trial. You are the result. A new name is whispered to them, a name chosen by the order. The old identity is buried. Step 4. Ascension. They are led, blindfolded, back to the surface and celebrated in song, not for who they are, but for who they've been programmed to become. This was the moment of total inversion. The death of the inner world. The installation of the synthetic soul. And what's worse, the subject believed it was their own decision. This met. Hod was later exported, refined in the black vaults of MK Ultra, encoded into trauma-based therapy models, and now quietly lives in rebranding as transformative coaching and breakthrough modalities. Different packaging, same spiral descent. What happened in the Well is now happening online, in boardrooms, in retreats led by influencers who call themselves healers. They'll tell you to let go of your old story. They'll tell you your identity is the obstacle. They'll lead you, smiling, into mental erasure, and you'll thank them for it. Unless you remember the Well, unless you descend with eyes open, because to break the ritual, you must first witness it in full. And that's what we'll do next. Beneath the Well, there was another chamber. It was not drawn on any map, not marked by any scripture. Even the sisters spoke of it only in symbols, in nightmares, in veiled whispers passed down in candlelit confession. They called it the Hollow. It was carved directly into the bedrock, older than the convent, older than Millbridge itself. A natural void, or perhaps something far worse. Every stone in that room was blackened, scorched by something that left no ash. There were no torches, no altars. Only a circle of stone, carved in geometric perfection, 12 feet across and lined with spirals that drew the eye inward until it felt like you were falling just looking at them. And in the center, always in the center, was the chair. Not a throne, not a seat of honor. It was a restraint, carved from petrified wood and fitted with rusted iron clasps, each one perfectly shaped for human limbs. The Ashfords didn't build the Hollow. They found it, buried beneath layers of glacial earth, protected by a vault of granite and silence. When they first uncovered it during the convent's construction, they sent word to their European contacts, not to theologians, but to antiquarians tied to forgotten orders within the church. The response was immediate and chilling. Do not close it. Do not seal it. Feed it. You read that right. Feed it. Because whatever the hollow was, it was not empty. It was awake, and it required emotion. Not offerings, not worship, but psychic fuel, fear, grief, surrender. Every woman broken in the well became a signal. Every scream was a frequency. Every obliteration of self sent a pulse into the hollow, and in return, the sisters received dreams, detailed instructions, blueprints for obedience systems that hadn't yet been invented, psychological techniques that wouldn't reach the mainstream for another 200 years. The hollow was not a pris, when it was a transmitter. It gave the Ashfords their edge, their power, their certainty, because they were not just serving a god, they were serving something far older than God. A presence that fed on obedience, a predator that did not want blood, it wanted consent. And the more willingly it was given, the deeper its influence could spread, until its whispers no longer needed words, until its programming became instinct, until we became the transmission system. And here's the most unsettling truth. The hollow still exists. The convent may be gone, the Ashfords may be dust, but the circle beneath Maine remains, unmapped, unspoken, still pulsing, still waiting, still feeding. The Ashfords were never meant to remain isolated. They were initiators, missionaries of something far more ambitious than religion, a bloodline of control. Shortly after the hollow was uncovered, Mother Agatha began receiving correspondences from figures she had never contacted, men and women whose seals bore no national allegiance, no church, no house, just a black spiral stamped in wax. Their letters spoke in riddles, symbols, and one recurring phrase, "The eye sleeps beneath the spine." What did it mean? That the true seat of power in the human body and in human society wasn't in the mind, but in the backbone, in the structures, in what holds people upright and obedient, and those who controlled the spine of civilization, schools, courts, doctrine, medicine, ritual, controlled the eye within the soul. These emissaries weren't allies, they were assessors. They came to observe, to test, and eventually to recruit. By 1806, the Ashford name began appearing in correspondence with obscure estates in the Scottish Highlands, with certain Jesuit enclaves in Quebec, and even with elite families in the newly forming American legal system. All of them shared one obsession: inheritance, not of land, not of wealth, but of method. The hollow wasn't just a location, it was a blueprint, a pattern to be exported and hidden in plain sight. And so, over the next 50 years, the Ashford system metastasized into a chain of private institutions for wayward girls across the Northeast, into elite finishing schools in Boston and Montreal, funded by old money, shielded by new laws, and into psychiatric clinics masquerading as moral rehabilitation centers during the rise of American industrial psychiatry. The bloodline extended too. By 1842, official census records show the Ashford surname disappearing from Maine altogether. But the names Tempest, Altham, Carow, and Marlowe begin to appear, carrying the same signatures, the same symbols, the same chilling results. Obedient women, broken men, generations of silence. Even today, these names show up in unexpected places. Think tanks, behavioral research labs, therapeutic empires, leadership training organizations. The techniques have changed. The goal has not. Total interior governance. The hollow demanded one thing above all else: the death of the sovereign self. And its priests, disguised as scholars, doctors, executives, still preach its gospel, just wrapped in smiles, subsidies, and TED Talks. And if you've ever wondered why no matter how much you learn, how much you grow, how much you heal, you still feel hollow, it's because they installed it in you. The same void that fed on the screams beneath stone walls now feeds on your digital despair. The most terrifying truth is this: you don't need whips or cages to enslave a human being. All you need is 3 simple neurological mechanisms, and the Ashfords mastered them all long before neuroscience gave them names. These weren't just superstitions, they were scientifically precise. Step 1. Neuropattern interruption. Destroy the subject's rhythm. Sleep, food, light, scramble them. Their brain becomes desperate for a new pattern, any pattern. Even if it hurts, even if it humiliates, they'll cling to it like breath. That's why the convent banned clocks, shifted mealtimes, isolated women in lightless cells, then flooded them with sensory overload in prayer sessions. Their goal: neural disorientation. Because when the old world collapses inside the mind, the subject becomes pliable. Step 2. Anchor implantation. In moments of confusion and vulnerability, insert a symbol, a word, a face, a doctrine. Make it the only thing stable in the chaos. Repeat it, reinforce it. The brain, starving for meaning, clings to the anchor like a drowning man to driftwood. Mother Agatha's voice became that anchor. For thousands, her tone, measured, calm, righteous, was the only safe thing in a world of torment. She didn't just teach obedience, she became it. Today, your anchor is that blue checkmark, that motivational influencer voice, that algorithm that floods your feed when you say what they want to hear. Same technique. Digital delivery. Step 3. Trigger conditioning. Once the new identity is installed, you train the subject to police themselves with rewards and punishments. Smile, get praised, doubt, get shamed, submit, be loved, speak truth, be destroyed. This is not behavior, it's wiring, and it's happening to you. Every time you hesitate to speak freely, every time you rewrite your thoughts to fit the correct frame, every time you feel guilt for instincts that once made you strong, you are running their program. But here's the secret the Ashfords never foresaw. Awareness collapses conditioning. Not instantly, but like acid on a lock, enough exposure dissolves the grip. When you name the pattern, when you trace the cycle, when you watch yourself hesitate and ask, whose voice is this? You begin to sever the loop. You unlearn obedience. You starve the hollow, not by fighting it head-on, but by refusing to feed it your confusion, your shame, your silence. And the moment you do, you become something the system cannot digest, a sovereign mind. But there's one thing more dangerous than obedience. In every era, in every experiment, in every controlled institution, there is always one. One who doesn't break, one who doesn't bend, one who looks into the eyes of power and says, no. In Ashford records, buried under layers of aliases and rewritten case notes, this person was known only as Subject 41B. She arrived in the winter of 1811. Age, 19, unwed, literate, fiercely defiant. Her father, a minor landowner near Portland, had institutionalized her for seditious behavior. Translation: she asked too many questions and refused to be tamed. Her real name has been scrubbed from every state record. But what happened over the next 7 months nearly dismantled the entire Ashford system. They isolated her, starved her, flooded her with scripture, contradiction, and whispered damnation. She refused to weep. They put her through the well, twice. Still, she would not convert. And then, against protocol, they brought her into the hollow. No witness ever entered that place and left unchanged. Most screamed, some collapsed, others forgot their own names. But Subject 41B, she laughed. Not out of madness, but mockery. As she sat bound to the petrified chair, surrounded by centuries of shadows, she whispered one phrase into the void. You can't take what you didn't build. It wasn't bravado, it was truth. Because in her mind, there were no cracks, no guilt, no shame, no open portals for the parasite to enter. She had claimed her own soul long before they tried to possess it. And that was her immunity. The hollow recoiled. The Ashfords panicked. Within days, their rituals failed. Subjects began resisting. Dream transmissions grew static. It was as if one unbreakable soul created a rupture in the entire lattice, a virus in their system. A mirror held up to the lie. They kept her chained for another 31 days. Then she disappeared. Some say she escaped. Others believe she was buried beneath the convent walls. But the truth, she became a ghost in their machine. A legend whispered among other women in their care, passed cell to cell, prayer to prayer. Be like 41. And in every generation since, she's returned, not in body, but in spirit. The woman who cannot be owned, the man who will not kneel, the sovereign one, the unbreakable. That archetype lives in you, buried, fenced in, drowned by years of conditioning, but not dead. There is a moment in every man's life, usually quiet, usually private, when he realizes he has been living someone else's idea of who he should be. And worse, he agreed to it, not because he was weak, but because he was shaped, conditioned, subtly taught to trade instinct for approval, truth for peace, aggression for emotional intelligence that always seemed to neuter more than heal. That moment isn't shameful, it's holy. It means you're waking up. The Ashfords built their entire empire to prevent that moment from ever happening, because they knew one awakened mind becomes radioactive. It infects others. It speaks with forbidden clarity. It refuses to nod along when something smells like rot. And so they did everything to sever that moment from your life. They turned boldness into toxicity. They turned introspection into self-doubt. They turned masculine protection into patriarchal oppression. All so you would never hear the voice inside that says, I remember who I am. But here's the truth, brother. You were never broken. You were buried. Under doctrine. Under trauma. Under 1,000 false choices designed to keep you busy, but not dangerous. And now, it's time to resurrect. Because the Ashford system isn't just history, it's the model for what's been done to generations of men, dissolve the will, distort the truth, disguise submission as growth. But that model has a flaw. It depends on silence. It needs you to feel alone. So here's how we break it right now. In the comments below, I want you to type this phrase twice. The hollow starves when I speak. The hollow starves when I speak. Say it. Write it. Own it. Not for me, for you. Because every time you speak truth that was buried, every time you choose clarity over compliance, every time you refuse to edit your power to make others comfortable, you are starving the holly in. Now, you are undoing centuries of control, one breath at a time. This isn't self-help, it's spiritual warfare. And if you're still watching, still here, then you've already chosen your side. In 1904, the last surviving member of the original Ashford bloodline arrived in New York City under a new name, Evelyn Ashford Gray. Publicly, she was a socialite, a philanthropist, founder of a women's mental wellness initiative, praised by the New York Times. Privately, she was the archivist, the keeper of the original rites, the protocols from the well, the records from the hollow, and she brought them not to a church, but to a banker. His name was Edward Cabot Lowell III, an heir to a powerful financial dynasty, one of the founding families behind a new organization with global ambitions, the Federal Reserve. Evelyn had no interest in interest rates. What she brought was not currency, but control systems. In private meetings, documented in barely legible shorthand by one of Lowell's aides, Evelyn outlined something chilling. A scalable method for the suppression of deviant female psychology and the redirection of rebellious masculine impulse into economic utility. She wasn't talking about institutions. She was talking about infrastructure, and Lowell listened. Because while the Ashfords had perfected obedience behind stone walls, Lowell wanted to embed it in commerce, education, and eventually, technology. And so, in 1911, with private funding from 5 industrial families, Evelyn founded the Aletheia Institute, a seemingly progressive organization for the advancement of psychological sciences. It was a front, a petri dish where Ashford methodologies were tested on soldiers, immigrants, orphans, silent chambers, compliance incentives, neurological mapping decades before EEG machines existed. Their most successful product, a curriculum, one that could be deployed in public schools, a formula to condition attention, reward memorization, and destroy curiosity through standardization. The model student became the prototype for the modern Obed. An adult, productive, polite, perpetually unsure of his own voice. And at the top of this new structure, not priests, not teachers, not doctors, but executives, descendants of both the Ashfords and the Lowells, who understood that true control wasn't about religion anymore. It was about interface. Control the curriculum, and you control the citizen. Control the interface, and you control the identity. That is the true inheritance of the Ashford bloodline, an invisible dominion, not over land, not over law, but over the inner world, the real frontier, the real battlefield. And it didn't end in 1911. The Ashfords didn't die. They evolved. They were never just torturers in cloisters or shadows in candlelit halls. They were engineers of obedience, and by the mid-20th century they found their next cathedral, the interface, the screen. In 1954, a former Aletheia researcher named Harold Bennett, a direct descendant of the Ashford-Lowell Pact, filed a patent. It was a simple concept wrapped in psych-speak: behavioral feedback, conditioning through screen-based stimuli. It would later become the user engagement loop. You felt it. That endless scroll, that dopamine spike, that itch when you check your phone 30 times an hour, not for connection, but for permission to exist. It wasn't random. It was built, refined in labs, tested on schoolchildren, funded by the same elite trusts connected to Evelyn Ashford Gray's Institute, now renamed the Center for Cognitive Adaptation under the guise of educational reform. Their goal? Interface colonization. Take the rituals of control once used in the convents, silence, attention loops, symbolic anchoring, and embed them inside devices. That ping on your screen. It mimics the bell once used to trigger emotional shifts during confession. The heart icon, modeled after the reward symbol Ashford nuns painted above the beds of reformed women. Even the infinite scroll, a direct behavioral adaptation of the well descent, where the subject lost all sense of time, direction, and autonomy. They didn't just digitize your habits. They ritualized your identity. Every post you curate, every story you filter, every fear you suppress because it won't get likes. You're not expressing yourself. You're performing for the altar of the hollow. And now, they've trained a generation of men to confuse exposure with power, visibility with value, connection with consent. But here's what they fear most: you noticing the pattern. Because when you realize that your interface has been designed to fragment your attention, to dull your aggression, to soften your edge until you confuse compliance with kindness, you become a threat. You become what 41B became, a man who sees the screen not as a tool, but as a trap. And traps can be broken. If they built the system, they also revealed the blueprint, and in every prison they've designed, from convent cells to digital feeds, there's a weak point, a neurological backdoor. They call it a fail-safe, a method to keep subjects stable, but paradoxically, it can also be used to set them free. You've heard of triggers, you've felt them, but what they didn't tell you is this: you can install your own. Not all programming comes from them. Some can come from you. Let me show you how. The Ashfords used what they called recursive anchoring. They'd attach control phrases to physical sensations: cold floors, burning incense, the sting of a switch. Later, even a scent could return a woman to submission. Modern platforms use the same tactic, only now the anchor is sound, color, haptic feedback. That subtle buzz when you get a like, it's not feedback, it's a loop reset. And that moment of hesitation you feel before posting something real, that's not self-doubt, it's installed censorship. Now here's how we burn it down. Step 1. Interrupt the loop with a personal trigger phrase, not one they gave you, one you write. A code that reasserts your identity, raw, real, and unfiltered. Examples: my mind is mine. No man owns my voice. I remember who I was before they named me. Say it aloud when you feel the pull. Whisper it when the feed scrolls endlessly. This rewires the feedback loop. You stop reacting. You start commanding. Step 2, reclaim ritual. You were trained through ritual. Morning scroll, newsfeed check, dopamine hit. Replace it, not with silence, but with deliberate intensity. Cold water, bare earth, real breath. One act of embodied awareness every morning, not optional, not spiritual fluff, warfare. They use algorithmic ritual to fragment your soul. You use physical ritual to weld it back together. Step 3, trigger defiance uncoded. Mandod, build a micro-habit where every time you feel manipulated by a headline, an ad, a guilt-inducing post, you take a conscious opposite action. Not big, small. If they want you passive, lift something. If they want you silent, write the truth. If they want you scrolling, stand the hell up. Every action becomes a dagger. Every interruption becomes a signal. I remember. I refuse. I rewire. And with every repetition, you're no longer a user. You're a hacker. Words can lie. But symbols, they're eternal. They don't explain. They embed. They don't persuade. They program. And the Ashfords were masters of symbolic manipulation. They understood what most men still ignore. Control the symbol, and you control perception. Control perception, and you never need chains. Their convent was drenched in it. A broken star etched into every bed frame, a serpent coiled around a tree, carved into chapel pews, a mirror with no reflection above every cleansing room. Each was a message, not to the conscious mind, but the limbic system. And when Evelyn Ashford Gray passed her knowledge to Lowell's descendants, she passed this too, the Ashford Symbology Codex. It still exists, and once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Let's decode 3 of the most powerful icons still used by elite control systems today. The inverted flame, you'll find it stylized in university logos, global non-profits, and wellness brands. What looks like a torch? It isn't. It's a signal, illumination turned inward. Not enlightenment, but containment. It's a visual hex meant to imply growth while actually representing the extinguishing of will in exchange for curated knowledge. Ashford sanctuaries used it to mark cells for psychic silencing. Today it's used to brand safe spaces where speech is monitored and truth is sterilized. The hollow circle, found in therapy apps, mindfulness programs, even tech startup icons. A ring, perfectly empty in the center. It represents wholeness, they say. No, it represents erasure. The goal isn't peace, it's void. The loss of self under the mask of balance. Ashford doctrine described it as submission to the absolute silence. They taught their patients to seek the hollow. Now modern culture tells you the same thing, through logos and interfaces designed to look calming, but whose origins are ritualistic, aesthetics. The twinned serpent, you know it as the medical symbol, the caduceus. But the Ashfords never used it for healing. To them it represented dual hypnosis, the psychological model of 2 opposing lies wrapping around a single truth, choking it until the subject no longer knows which voice to obey. 2 serpents, left and right, science and religion, guilt and pride, wrapped around a spine that once stood straight. Ashford training rooms had it etched above every lectern. Modern institutions place it in every hospital, every pharmacy, every global health directive. And the most disturbing part, you trust it. You've seen these symbols your whole life. You never questioned them. That's the power of symbology. It doesn't require your belief. It only requires your repetition. But now, you see it. You speak its name. And by naming it, you sever its hold. Because once a symbol is decoded, it becomes inert. It loses the fog that gave it force, and that is the war they're losing. Men are awakening to the hidden language, the glyphs of the controllers, the ruins in plain sight. The Ashfords were never naive. They knew blood would thin. They knew walls would fall. They knew flesh dies. But ideas metastasize. And so in the winter of 1919, 3 months after Evelyn Ashford Gray vanished from public record, a final ritual was performed beneath the ruins of the original Maine convent. It was called simply the Continuum, a rite of psychogenic succession, not to pass on wealth or status or documents, but control, instinct. Ashford doctrine believed that psychic signatures, patterns of domination, compliance conditioning, and ritual focus could be imprinted generationally, not through mysticism, through ritualized trauma. The Continuum had one goal: fuse elite ideology to the bloodlines of power, so they gathered surviving Ashford matriarchs, male heirs from transatlantic banking families, neutral vessel from a controlled orphanage in Vermont. The details are scattered in private journals, burned letters, and one surviving phonograph cylinder, labeled only Ashford Protocol, C1919. We listen to it. What you hear is not language. It's a tonal sequence, droning, layered, hypnotic, binaural frequencies decades ahead of their time. The sound was played on loop during the ceremony. Each participant was sleep-deprived, fasting, and dosed with alkaloids derived from Hyoscyamus niger, black henbane. Their writings describe visitation, a presence that did not arrive from the outside, but from within. The moment of fusion was not an explosion. It was an agreement. They believed they had forged something eternal, an echo that survives flesh, a pattern that inherits bodies. The voice of structure forever seeking to reorder the mind. They didn't call it a demon. They called it the architect. And since 1920, every Ashford-descended institution has modeled itself after this internal geometry, hierarchical, sanitized, obsessed with symmetry and silence. You've seen it in the design of psychiatric hospitals. You've felt it in the lobbies of elite universities. You've walked through it in government buildings where the air feels like glass, empty, sterile, soulless. That's the architect. Not a ghost, not a person. A program, carried in ideology, in ritual, in elite inheritance, and it did not die. It migrated into corporations, think tanks, NGO consortiums, and global councils that still echo the Ashford tone, order at any cost. But here's the fatal flaw: no pattern is eternal when it's seen. The moment you recognize the architect's design, you can reject it, refuse to mirror it, refuse to let it replicate in you, because that's what it needs: your participation, your silence, your shape. Control systems don't survive by force. They survive by repetition, by architecture, by ritual dressed in reason, and the Ashford Continuum, what they called the pattern that commands, was never meant to be seen as dark. It was meant to be normalized. Hidden inside 3 institutions: education, therapy, technology. Let's start with education. By the 1950s, the Aletheia Institute had seeded its principles into dozens of curriculum models under names like progressive behavioral learning and effective conditioning. Sounds harmless, but the framework was pure Ashford. Silence equals virtue, obedience equals intelligence, questioning equals pathology. Classrooms became cloisters. Standardized testing became ritual submission. And gifted students, almost always the ones most willing to adapt to containment. By the time a child finished 12 years inside this structure, the pattern was etched into them. Do not speak unless prompted. Your worth is performance. Authority defines truth. Sound familiar? Now look at therapy. What began as a discipline to heal the mind was, by design, restructured to pathologize dissent. The Ashford lineage, through descendants and controlled research grants, helped shape the DSM, the psychiatric Bible. Who was declared sick? The man who refuses structure. The woman who resists normalization. The child who won't sit still under fluorescent light. Modern therapy framed discomfort as dysfunction, anger as disorder, grief as something to regulate, not confront. The language changed, but the structure didn't. Still Ashford, still the hollow, still compliance behind soft eyes and soft hands. And then came technology. Where education conditioned you and therapy neutralized you, tech harnessed you. Every interface you touch now reflects Ashford design, minimalism as moral virtue, infinite scroll as a feedback trance, notifications as digital bells calling you to obedience, and every choice they give you. Illusion. You're not choosing between options. You're choosing between approved roles within a system built to extract your attention, convert it into data, and sell the simulation of control back to you. That's the architect's ultimate triumph. Not to enslave you with chains, but with customization, a cage you think you designed. But here's what they didn't account for. The embodied masculine will. It doesn't scroll. It doesn't comply. It doesn't seek approval through sterilized interfaces. It moves. It builds. It rejects containment on instinct. That instinct is your final weapon. Not an idea, not a belief, a biological truth. One that no ritual, no interface, no algorithm can overwrite once it wakes up. Final section. The Macabre History of the Ashford Family, a Sinister Tale. You've seen the architecture of control. You've traced the bloodline from convent walls to digital chains. You've tasted the poison in education, therapy, and screens. Now comes the moment they feared most, because history doesn't end with understanding. It ends with refusal. The Ashfords built their legacy on one principle: silence is salvation. But silence was always the first ritual, not the last. And you've broken that spell. You heard the screams behind the stone. You saw the scalpel dressed as doctrine. You learned that the most dangerous prisons are not made of bars, but belief. They believed you would never look deeper, that you would accept the script, that your masculinity would be pacified, filtered, and absorbed into their machine. But here you are, and there is no going back. Let me speak plainly now, not in myth, not in metaphor. You were raised in a culture of ritualized weakness, trained to fear your voice, taught that your instincts are toxic, your aggression uncivilized, your desire to protect and command problematic. But that wasn't psychology, that was engineering. They call it progress, but it's just the Ashford rite, digitized, mass-produced, and sold to men as virtue. A ritual of castration masked as compassion. A system that feeds on obedience disguised as peace. But your mind is waking up. And now you must make a choice. You can close this video. Return to your curated feed. Let the hunger for control numb itself again with comfort, or you can lock it in, right now. Comment this phrase twice below: I see the hollow, I won't kneel. Say it aloud, type it with intent. Let the algorithm watch. Let them know you're no longer a subject of silence, because the Ashford system didn't die in the ruins of Maine. It mutated, it metastasized, and it still breathes every time a man doubts his own fire. But it can be destroyed, not with protest, with presence, not with slogans, with sovereignty. You are not here to obey. You are not here to be healed by their sick hands. You are not broken, weak, or dangerous. You are awake. And once a man awakens, there is nothing more terrifying to the system than the sound of his first uncompromised command. This was the macabre history of the Ashford family. But it was never just a story, it was a mirror. And now that you've seen what's behind the reflection, you decide what burns next.